Conspiracy with May Brussell. For the past 14 years, May has been researching and uncovering facts and evidence from between the lines of the news and placing them in a more thorough perspective of how conspiracy, political assassination, and abuses of power affect us all. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB-FM in Carmel, California. And now, May Brussell.
Good evening. This is May Brussell in Carmel, California. It's Dialogue Conspiracy number 301. This is December 25th, 1977. It's Merry Christmas for those people in Carmel or Salinas or Santa Cruz area and the people that receive the tapes in the north and east. It will be New Year's, Happy New Year, and Merry Christmas for all of you, whatever time of the year you receive these tapes. I do date them just for the purpose of getting this information into a time slot, because many times we have things on the air that don't appear for months or years later, and it's interesting to show at what time period they were here on this program, and people do collect the tapes and cassettes, and that's why they're numbered. I like to think that each tape is timely for all time and pertains to the information that people want, to put the pieces of the puzzle together about who is doing the conspiring and killing in the United States and affecting lives around the world through the purposeful planning of these large conspiracies affected by the assassination of particular people. The tapes are going out of the country, all over the country, various colleges that I do not name anymore on the air because when I did, they began to become suppressed. But this is going to be a good year. I know in terms of my research, after 14 years of research, this is a very good year. There are a lot of things in the offing, and the information is getting out at all levels, and I am more optimistic now than ever that these truths can't be suppressed too much longer. Paul Krasner, the publisher of The Realist, many of you know now that he's become editor and publisher of a new magazine, The Hustler. Mr. Flynn handed him the magazine, and Paul and I have been very close friends for 5 years. He published my first 3 articles, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped?, that went into the American assassins and the links of Richard Nixon to the Nazis in Germany and how Nixon came to power. And then Paul published my story, The Senate Select Committee is Part of the Cover-Up. And then the whole article, The Realist, in 1974 was the SLA is the CIA. Paul paid his dues all of these years. He became blacklisted on the campuses, the lecture circuit. He's been dirt poor. He did publish without editing out any part of the articles that I gave him, all the information I gave him. And because of that, he was ignored by a lot of people, and his information or his type of humor was suppressed. Now he has received this magazine with a huge salary, and he called me the day that he came home from Ohio and promised that the conspiracy newsletter that he was going to get out for me and couldn't would start rolling, and the people that had paid their subscription would get a year's subscription to Hustler, and I'll be writing 1 article a month in there called Dialogue Conspiracy, which will be about information which we've had on these shows or new information that'll be reaching millions of people around the country. He also asked for the story on the killing of the rock musicians, the 40 or more musicians that have died that I believe were murdered and purposely drugged, that We Magazine wanted. They bought the story and suppressed it. Paul is going to press with that story, and he will be printing my article on the MK Ultra and the drug control of the Son of Sam. The movie that was suppressed this last year that I made, the Howard Hughes mystery that we talked about on Dialogue Conspiracy number 275, that was June the 25th program, is still suppressed, and part of the film was missing, and National Enquirer called me about that, and they may be doing a story on how the film was stolen and missing in the movie shelf. The movie was $1.5 million production, and the National Enquirer called me to see about that. I also am helping with several books that are in the offing, and they are dynamite material and will be affecting a lot of people and exposing more of this huge conspiracy. So I'll be very busy in 1978, and I hope that these truths just keep unfolding. Paul had a lot of courage. He wrote many, many articles up to the time that I started writing for him. I had been subscribed to The Realist, and he covered such items such as the one I did on the Senate Select Committee, and I talked about the plans of G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt to murder the president of Panama. I said they had the plans to kill the president of Panama in 1971 because the president wasn't cooperating in the control of narcotics down in Panama with the CIA. Our CIA has been a large market of narcotics all over the world, and this is one of their main sources of business and control. Jack Anderson published in 1977, December 17th, 4 years after the article I put in the Realist. This is a quotation from Anderson. Shadowy rumors that the Watergate plotters were going to kill Panamanian dictator Omar Torrijos, that they planned to assassinate him, the White House plumbers, and it goes into the narcotic dealings and the drug dealings in Panama. After E. Howard Hunt got out of prison, he told a Boston television interviewer that there was concern over Panama's drug smuggling, and if Torrijos didn't shape up and cooperated, he was going to be wasted. This is E. Howard Hunt's quotation about the plans to kill him, and we had published that, as I say, 4 years ago in The Realist. The most courage Paul had, I think, in the first Watergate story was the article I did, the center section of the Watergate story, The American Assassins Are Mutations, and it has to do with the combination of Allen Dulles of our Central Intelligence Agency combining with General Reinhard Gehlen and forming the CIA. This is an important story because pieces of this story are just emerging in the news. I saw the David Susskind show on American assassinations, and Peter Dale Scott was on there talking about the Mr. Spaz-Reagan meeting Marina Oswald, Lee Oswald in New York City, or at the boat at New Jersey when they came over from the Soviet Union, and how this gentleman belonged to the Anti-Communist League, and he was part of the Gehlen operation. And I published in The Realist that Marina Oswald was an agent of Reinhard Gehlen's operation, the Nazis, and belonged to the white Russian community that had been rearmed and sent all over the world to instigate another war against Russia after World War II didn't succeed. The Cold War would take place, and Marina Oswald was used in the Dallas-Fort Worth area along with these other Nazis and could plant the evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald and make the assassination appear that somebody of leftist leanings or Castro sympathy was responsible for the killing of John Kennedy. These were Gehlen agents, and Paul had published that article in 1972. Well, he is going to be rewarded for the efforts that he made to uncover the truth, and these articles are sold all the time. I'm answering letters and mail on these articles, and I'm really happy that he's going to be in a position now with Hustler with a larger mailing than he ever had with The Realist, and can continue to get out the kind of information that he wants to get to the American people. There was one article in the San Francisco Chronicle this week, dated December the 22nd, about Chief Justice Lewis Powell on the Supreme Court, and it said he refused permission for the American Nazi Party in Houston, Texas, to keep playing their tape-recorded telephone messages. They had a tape-recording message where they offer $5,000 prize to kill Jews or blacks. The American Nazi Party in Houston, Texas, had a big bounty, or has, and this was a tape-recorded advertisement. Hitmen used to come from $25 to $500, but these telephone messages ran like this, quotes, "We are calling for an all-out war against Jews and other non-whites. We are beginning a battle. We offer a $5,000 prize for every non-white killed during an attack on a white person. We offer this reward to alleviate some of the legal problems of fellow white people. We are encouraging mass executions of non-whites in order to make their stay in this country an unhealthy one." They said this is not a call to violence or criminal acts, but $5,000 is available. Well, Chief Justice Lewis Powell, along with Leon Jaworski, worked in Germany in the Nuremberg trials and let all of the main Nazis off, and I think only 8 were hung, even though there'd been 80 million deaths after World War II, totaled up, and another 80 million displaced and damaged. And he let many of these Nazis off and come to the United States and settle in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in Houston, and all around the world. But maybe Chief Justice Powell realizes, even at this late date, that they're going too far. So the Supreme Court has called off those telephone messages, but the bounty is still there, and I think it's important to add up how many Jews and non-whites are being murdered around this country. I'm doing that now. Certain murders in New Rochelle, such as Sister Cowan did, that seemed senseless, or Stacy Moskowitz, and this one shooting of Son of Sam, where he said he was directed or told where to shoot. I'm wondering just how many Jews were involved or have been killed that appeared to be senseless killing, and how many people of the Nazi Party and trained to be anti-Semitic are killing these people, and if this thing is more planned than people realize and not just happenstance. Well, last week I mentioned that I would go into the Gemstone file. Many people have asked me to talk about the Gemstone file on Dialogue Conspiracy, and I looked at the index of the shows, and I never have done it with you. So I brought it in, and I'm going to read you part of the Gemstone file and explain what it is today. And then next week I'll do more, and it will be a 2 or 3 part session on Dialogue Conspiracy about the Gemstone file. These pages, there's approximately 20 typewritten pages. I'm not going to read all 20 to you on the air. You can send for it. I can make copies if you want. The cost of copying it is 10 cents a page plus the postage, and mail them to you in case you don't have it. These are circulated. They're in London, they're in Ireland, they're all over the United States, and they were put together by a person named Stephanie Caruana. She came to my house to do an interview with me on for Playgirl magazine, when she saw the material I had, and co-authored with me a story on the death of Howard Hughes being buried off a Greek island, a case which I'm still working on and trying to get that body exhumed in Houston, Texas, to prove that that isn't Howard Hughes and that our article was the correct one. She came to my house to work on the Howard Hughes story because she saw all this material around, and I showed her what is the Gemstone files. It's from Bruce Roberts. I don't know any other person that has the complete set. They were a series of letters that he wrote to his mother, or a diary that he kept for himself, and the whole file is about 300 pages, and as I said last week on Dialogue Conspiracy, I have it copied, and I have 3 copies put somewhere, each in a different place to be safe, and I believe I'm the only person in the United States that has it. Stephanie went through the 300 pages and went up to see Bruce Roberts. He was living in San Francisco at the time. As I said, he's dead now. He died of a brain tumor about 6 months ago. And she wrote a summary of 20 typewritten pages, in essence, of what Bruce had to say and what he wanted the world to know. And the summary is called The Skeleton Key to the Gemstone Files. I met Bruce Roberts when my first article came out, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? He got in touch with Paul Krasner and myself, and he gave us this document. I was staying with some friends at Geary Street in San Francisco, and he came and brought it to me one evening, and we were up with him till about 1 o'clock, and kind of shaky and very nervous about the way it was put on us and given to me, and didn't know anything about Bruce at the time. And so I went with a friend downstairs, and we decided we'd go out and get a cup of coffee. And when we went out, there was a car in back of us with a man standing by the parking meter near Venice and Geary. And we got in our car, and he got in the car behind us and followed us. And we looked in our car, and the whole car had been pilfered, and documents and letters of the party that I was with taken out of the car, and the suitcases in there taken away, and a radio was taken. It looked like a burglary, but everything was thrown around inside the car. And we had a chase in San Francisco up and down the streets, and by then it was 2 or 2:30, and everything was empty, and we couldn't find a place to pull up, and there were 2 cars that zeroed in on us and followed us. And then we finally went to about 3:30 or 4 in the morning, went to an all-night restaurant that was open on Geary, and said the heck with it. If they're following us, I didn't know what to do. And we went in, got something to eat. We went back to where we were staying, and we were locked out. I didn't have the key, and finally went to KSAN radio station, and just as luck would have it, we went upstairs, and I remember they had a waterbed in the lobby, which they didn't have anymore, and we fell asleep on the floor on some beanbag chairs till the morning. I had a radio show around 9 or 10. So I was carrying these Gemstone files with us all night through this wild chase, and was really up all night, and then I concentrated on them and didn't have a chance to go through it, and was wondering what in the world was here. And it was a funny scene, sort of funny now, but it wasn't funny then. And I have the large set of files, as I say, all of the documents or what he wrote about them. So they were at my house, and I'll read you some of the points about them that are pertinent to you, and I'll read you some of the places where I differ, and this is why I haven't used it in terms of writing yet or getting it published. and I hope the people that want to make the movie in England will seriously go over the material with me, because some of it is in error and some of it is correct. I'll start just by reading you sections of it, and you'll know what it is, because many of you have heard it by name and are not familiar with the works. It begins by saying, it is dangerous to transmit or even to possess this information. There is no copyright on this material. Anyone who wishes may reproduce it. Credit will go where credit is due after the mess has been cleaned up. The Gemstone file was written in many segments over a period of years by an American named Bruce Roberts. Parts of the file were released to certain Americans starting in 1969. The number of pages is over 1,000. I have about 350. It says there are 1,000. It has been possible to verify some of the statements, but research facilities required to verify the entire story would be monumental. Although parts of it seem improbable, in general it rings true. Since the scope is so large and the events described are so complex and interlocking, the skeleton outline of the Gemstone thesis is merely a guide. It begins with the year 1932. Aristotle Onassis, a Greek ship owner who made his first $1 million, was selling Turkish tobacco known as opium in Argentina. He worked out a profitable deal with Joseph Kennedy, who is into the whiskey business in Ireland, transporting to this country, and Eugene Meyer, who's the father of Mrs. Graham, who owns the Washington Post, and Meyer Lansky. They imported bootleg liquor into the United States. And also, when Prohibition was over, in the liquor bottles was opium and heroin and cocaine, disguised as liquor. In 1934, Aristotle Onassis, the Rockefellers, and the 7 oil sisters, the major oil companies, signed an agreement where they outlined an oil cartel memo, which in essence said, screw the Arabs out of their oil. Transport it on Onassis' ship. This was done, and those who did it considerably increased their already vast wealth. Now, the Gemstone file was given to me in 1972. Since that time, we have learned that Robert Mayu of the Youth Organization worked with Mr. Niakros, the competitor of Aristotle Onassis, to get the oil contracts from Saudi Arabia. So it wasn't Onassis who had the power. The Hughes oil contacts had more power because Onassis, who is made the fall guy of the entire Gemstone, had his son murdered, his ex-wife murdered. He died then all alone, and it seems that he didn't have the power. It's in the power of other people. And that's one of my objections to the Gemstone, is that Onassis keeps seeming to be the fall guy, but he in turn was done in, just like Nixon worked with them a long time, and then they took Nixon and did him in. Onassis and Nixon had the power up to a point, and then each of them was expendable. There's an article last week that the reason we're arming Iran is to take over Saudi Arabia, and that's consistent with the Gemstone files of the 7 sisters, because John J. McCloy, the lawyer for the Rockefellers, a member of the Warren Commission, started the organization of 7 sisters, and they did form an oil cartel, and they do intend to take the oil from the Arabs if they need to militarily. Bruce Roberts studied journalism and physics at the University of Wisconsin. He studied crystallography, synthetic rubies, and made the original Gemstone experiments, and this is why it's called the Gemstone file. In 1936 to 1940, Eugene Meyer, part of the syndicate with Onassis and Rockefeller, bought the Washington Post. Later, Eugene Meyer is killed, and a suicide is forced, the type of George de Mohrenschildt recently, but Meyer bought the Washington Post. Other mafia members bought newspapers, radios, and magazines to control the news media. As the war approaches, new censorship of all major media went into effect. 1941 to 45 was World War II, which was profitable for Aristotle Onassis, the Rockefellers, the Kennedys, the Roosevelts, I.G. Farben. Onassis was selling oil and arms to both sides, as were ITT, American corporations, General Motors. They were selling tanks, airplanes to Hitler and to America at the same time. He says these people went through the war without losing a single ship or man. At the end of the war, the Nazi experts assimilated into the Pentagon and infiltrated the highest levels of government. And that is what I published. Also, through my research, before I knew Bruce Roberts, I had published that in my first article, The Realist. He says, Alan Dulles went in partnership with ex-Nazi Reinhard Gehlen and formed a new agency, to be called the Central Intelligence Agency. In 1949, Aristotle Onassis bought U.S. surplus Liberty ships in questionable illegal purchases, and lawyer Burke Marshall helped him. Burke Marshall's important because in the case of the Kennedy assassination, he has been the man to lock up the National Archives to any of the researchers, and he was working with this team way back when. He also was on the Vera Foundation of WBAI in New York, which is supposed to be a liberal radio station. Burke Marshall has been in control of bottling up the conspiracy truth ever since John Kennedy was killed. John Kennedy wasn't the man that they thought he was going to be, and Burke Marshall and the team that I mentioned above have continued to suppress the murder of this president. In 1956, according to Bruce Roberts, Howard Hughes, the Texas millionaire, was buying his way into control of the United States. He bought senators, governors. He bought his last politician, his newly elected Vice President Nixon, via a $250,000 non-repayable loan to Nixon's brother Donald. Now, there's one error in this that I differ with Bruce in the Gemstone file, and I'll interject my opinions as we go on. Howard Hughes and this group bought Richard Nixon in 1946 when he ran against Mr. Voorhees in California. Nixon was still in the Navy, and I wrote about that on how Nixon gets to power. And Nixon met Howard Hughes in a bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel, and when he was just a member of the House of Representatives, and then a senator, and then a vice president, he was being funded by this Committee of 100 and these neo-Nazis of California, the agriculture business, the aerospace business. Howard Hughes was buying Richard Nixon as a front man in 46, not 56. He goes on to say early in 1957, Richard Nixon then repaid the favor to Howard Hughes for giving his brother this $250,000 by forming an Internal Revenue's tax-free foundation called the Hughes Medical Institute, with the Hughes aircraft being sole owner. It was a tax-free, non-accountable money funnel or launder for whatever Howard Hughes wanted to do. The U.S. government antitrust suits against Hughes, TWA, and other enterprises were shelved. The Medical Institute in Florida was a funnel for funding members of Congress, all those very congressmen that won't open up the assassinations now or the conspiracies. Gerald Ford was one of the recipients of that money, and he was the one who put Richard Nixon, he was selected by Richard Nixon to be on the Warren Commission, and Richard Nixon then selected him to become President of the United States. The Hughes Medical Institute down in Florida goes into a lot of questionable operations. It's simply an office building with a handful of people, and goodness knows where the money goes, but some of it has been pinpointed, like the Korean CIA, to the members of Congress, so that Richard Nixon formed this institute which funded other members of Congress that would vote for him later to put him into power. It not only saved tax money for Howard Hughes, but by paying Richard Nixon several $100,000, he got what he wanted. Nixon formed this institute for Howard Hughes, and then it funded the politicians that kept Richard Nixon going until he began to become President of the United States. The Gemstone goes on in March 1957. Aristotle Onassis carried out a carefully planned action. He had Hughes kidnapped from the bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel, using Hughes' own men, such as Chester Davis, who was born Mr. Cesare, C-E-S-A-R-E, in Sicily, Italy, and the other Hughes men either quit or fired or stayed on the Onassis organization. Now, the Gemstone has an error here, which should be cleared, because people I know have copies of the skeleton Gemstone, and I can answer these questions for you on the air and share some of the facts with you as against what Bruce wrote. In March 57, Howard Hughes was kept in the bungalow of the Beverly Hills Hotel. He wasn't kidnapped, but he was isolated. He was as good as kidnapped, but he wasn't taken down to the Bahamas like he said. He was kidnapped from his hotel. That is a fact. That is an error. He was kept in the bungalow from 57 to 66. And he never, 1966, and he never saw any of his old aides. Noah Dietrich was fired. Robert Mayu of the CIA was taken over. He was also in the FBI. The assassination teams were incorporated into the Hughes organization, and the Hughes organization at that point became the Hitler organization, the Nazi organization, the secret government. Hughes' body didn't matter anymore. They could give him the heroin and cocaine and the injections and drug him out of his mind. He was taken on a train from Los Angeles to Boston in 1966, and again, only seen from a doctor from the Medical Institute, this office building in Texas, that came up to Boston. So 57 to 66, he was kept in the bungalow by the Los Angeles Police Department and the Beverly Hills Police Department, Captain Jack Eggers. And that is important because the kidnapping of youths or the care of youths didn't just involve Aristotle Onassis. In the Gemstone files, Bruce Roberts keeps pinpointing the Mafia and Onassis as if these were the two culprits. But it goes much bigger. It infiltrates the police departments at the local level. Beverly Hills Police, Los Angeles Police, the Dallas Police, down in the Bahamas, in Texas, and the Central Intelligence Agency and the FBI. It's true that narcotics trafficking is involved here, but it's also the satellite control of the world, the communications, media that's involved, and the Hughes Company are making the satellites for space stations and communications and for weapons. And they can use it for agricultural surveillance or oil surveillance or minerals and affect our whole lives by these satellites. And the satellites are made by the Hughes Organization and the CIA. So Howard was kept in that bungalow and then taken, literally kidnapped after he was zonked. He was kept around for enough people to say, oh, he's irresponsible or mentally sick or queer or he talks crazy. And then from Boston, there isn't a trace of a hair or a fingerprint or a sign of the real Howard Hughes. The Gemstone papers go on to say that a few days later, this is after March 57, in April, Mayor Cannon, the new Senator Cannon from Nevada, arranged a fake marriage to Jean Peters to explain Howard's sudden loss of interest in women. And this brain-damaged person was taken to the Emerald Isles Hotel in the Bahamas where the top floor was rented. Later, it said after he was injected with heroin for 30 days, he was taken to a cell on Onassis Island in Scorpios, where he spent the rest of his life. Onassis has a much larger power base in the United States, the Hughes Empire. Wayne Rector, the double, acted as Hughes' double since 1945 and became Howard Hughes. Now, to correct the Gemstones, I have been told that by what Brooks Randall said on Good Morning America that Brooks Randall, and not Wayne Rector, is the double that was buried, but we haven't seen a picture of Wayne Rector, or he hasn't surfaced. So it could be one of the two. It wasn't after a few days. The marriage to Jean Peters was fake. There was no fingerprint of an application for the wedding or a wedding certificate. Nobody saw the groom. The judge is dead. The woman at the office there in Nevada is dead. The circumstances of that wedding would prove without any doubt that there was no marriage to Jean Peters and that this was an excuse to get everybody off of the tail of Howard Hughes. I will go on. Our time is running out now. I just have about one more minute, and there's certain points I do want to make about the Gemstone file, about the meetings of the various people involved that Bruce Roberts talks about, so that I can correct them for you, some of the main points that are correct and that are in error, and maybe clarify it for you. And if you want to order the Gemstone, as I say, it's 20 pages. I'll make copies for you if you send me, it would be $2 plus about 50 cents postage. If you don't have a copy of the Key to the Gemstone, you can write to me and I send you a file, because our time is up. And I do think on Dialogue Conspiracy next week we'll finish off the Gemstone, just a summary. I'm not going to read you the 20 pages, but just a little bit, because many people are hearing about the Gemstone files and you want to know what it is. And we'll go in essence next week. Until then, have a good holidays, and we'll see you. I'm optimistic, as I say. We'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy, and we'll be exposing the truth as much as we can, continuously in 1978 as we did in 1977. We're all still around. It's coming out, so keep your spirits up. I'll see you next week.
You've been listening to Dialogue Conspiracy with Mae Brussell. It's time once again for Dialogue Conspiracy with Mae Brussell. For the past 14 years, Mae has been researching and uncovering facts and evidence from between the lines of the news and placing them in a more thorough perspective of how conspiracy, political assassination, and abuses of power affect us all. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB-FM in Carmel, California. And now, May Brussell.
Good evening. This is May Brussell in Carmel, California. This is Dialogue Conspiracy number 303, and it is January the 1st, 1978. We have to get used to that date. Last week on Dialogue Conspiracy, I had a Part 1 series. This evening will be a continuation, Part 2 of the Gemstone files. I got about 40 letters from people that listen to Dialogue Conspiracy or take the tapes asking me for a summary and analysis of the Gemstone files. I did some of it last week, and I'm going to go right into it now. For those of you that weren't here last week or didn't hear it, the Gemstone file, is the key to the Gemstone, is a document about 20 pages long. It's a summary of approximately 350 handwritten pages written by Bruce Roberts. Some sources say there's 1,000 pages, but I've never seen them. And as far as I know, I'm the only researcher in this country that has all of the handwritten pages of Bruce Roberts, and I have copied them and put them away where they can't be harmed or taken. And he wrote a story of the political power elite from the late 30s up to through Watergate and up to his death. He died of a brain tumor about a year ago. Bruce lived in San Francisco, and he gave me his research at the time of Watergate because he wanted me to know what he thought was the story behind Watergate, what led up to it. And because he had been at a certain bar in San Francisco on Geary Street where the Watergate defendants used to hang around. Right after Watergate arrest, the bartender there was killed. And I did go into that bar a couple of times to see what was going on. He claimed that G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt and John Ehrlichman and most of the Watergate defendants had an active role in their CIA intelligence work in San Francisco and hung around this bar. And he gave me a lot of information which has been circulating around the world. Many people have it, and as I say, they want to make a movie about the Gemstone key file in England. Parts of this file are true. Parts of them are absolutely untrue. Some of it is difficult to check. Some of it I have used for my own research and writing, and it's a very controversial document because it's filled with a lot of misinformation. I'm going to give some quotations of the Gemstone file this week and analyze them as much as we have time for, and do a critique of some of the information that I think is bad information. There's one section of the Gemstone file that is particularly interesting and controversial, and it has to do with the role of the present Pope, is Cardinal Montini, who he had made the allegations. Bruce Roberts had said that the Pope was part of the international narcotics traffic with the Mafia and the CIA since his early days as a cardinal. In quotes, this is from the Gemstone file, he said, "The battle of the Mafia narcotics traffic has been tangled with the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, specifically the Vatican and the Pope." It was Bruce Roberts who told me in 1972 that this current Pope was in the OSS and that he was linked to the Golden Triangle narcotics traffic in Southeast Asia that particularly escalated during the Vietnamese War. A year later, after he told me this information, a book came out on the history of the OSS, and it did link Cardinal Montini, who then became the Pope, as being in the OSS for the United States, and many people know that almost every agent in the OSS then became an officer or an agent of the CIA. Recently, there is a new book out that I quoted on Dialogue Conspiracy called Treason for My Daily Bread, which has to do with Cardinal Montini, naming him as the person who assisted Martin Bormann, the Nazi, and other Nazis to leave Italy and go to South America, that they went from Austria to Brenner Pass disguised as monks. And there's this information that is new about the Cardinal Montini, the Pope, working with Martin Bormann, the Nazi. In addition to that, the Gemstone file refers to Cardinal Tisserand. He was the head of the College of Cardinals at the Vatican, and Bruce Roberts claimed that he was murdered with sodium morphate. He said Tisserand had followed the career of this present Pope Montini, and that's the reason that he was murdered. Tisserand was murdered. He said Montini had also poisoned Pope Pius XI in order to become the Pope, and that he was banished from Rome for a time being by Pope Pius XII, and then returned and became the present Pope in 1963 the year that DM was murdered and John Kennedy was murdered. Bruce Roberts wrote in the Gemstone file that Tisserand wrote all of this down in his diaries, and at the time he called the present Pope, that was Cardinal Montini then, the Deputy of Christ at Auschwitz, meaning the extermination camp. And he said that Montini was the fulfillment of the Fatima prophecy that the Antichrist shall rise to become the head of the church. Now, this is pretty heavy stuff for a person to put in your hands, these allegations of the cardinal, and it has been confirmed the role of the present Pope in helping Martin Bormann and the Nazis escape. But the murder charges were never written up or discussed until just 1977. A new book came out 2 months ago called The Assassination Theory and Practice. It's put out by Richard Chameleon by Palladian Press in Colorado. It's a 1977 publication. And I'll just read you a couple of sentences from this book, which is the first book that I've seen or own that would back up Bruce Roberts' allegations. And these are quotations from the book. It says, a suggestion of intrigue surrounds the depth of Pope Pius XI. He died in bed in the Vatican at the age of 81. To his very last, Pope Pius XI was the deadly enemy of fascism, Benito Mussolini, and Adolf Hitler. Shortly before he died, Eugene Cardinal Tisserand was directed to convene a meeting of all Italian bishops to hear what His Holiness had to say, and what he had to say was against Nazism and fascism. Just before the meeting was to take place, Pope Pius XI was given what they called a stimulant. It was an injection, and an hour later His Holiness was dead, so that he couldn't meet with the bishops to object to Hitler's fascism or Mussolini's fascism. And the author asked in this book, where is the evidence for assassination? He said it is historical fact that Claretta Pettucci was Benito Mussolini's mistress for 8 years. Along with Mussolini, she was executed. Pettucci happened to be a fanatical pro-fascist, pro-Mussolini follower. Is it purely by chance or sheer coincidence that the father of Claretta Pettucci, the woman who lived with Mussolini, his name was Dr. Francesco Pettucci, was the senior Vatican physician who gave Pope Pius XI the injection, allegedly the stimulant, the hour before he died? Pope Pius was to meet and discuss with the bishops the evils of fascism, both German and Italian. Was Pope Pius XI murdered? This is in this new book on assassinations, and it is an excellent book. It just came out, and it goes into the origin of assassinations from the various countries and the way they're done. It's the first book that I've read in print that has linked Marina Oswald to the CIA, and that is a big jump in terms of information, that her uncle wasn't necessarily with the KGB, but branches of the CIA, which was in fact true. So Richard Chameleon asked the question, was the Pope murdered? And in the Gemstone files, Bruce Roberts had said in 1972 that both Tisserand and Pope Pius XI were murdered, and that would make sense if Cardinal Montini was working with the Nazis, if he was described as the Christ at Auschwitz, if he was in favor of letting Martin Bormann and the head Nazis go out of Italy, out of Austria to Italy to South America, and if this man was in charge of the Pope's health and his daughter lived with Benito Mussolini and they were confirmed fascists and the Pope was objecting to fascism, it's a good question coming out in literature now. Was the Pope murdered for his anti-fascist stance? And why would the father of this woman who lived with Mussolini all these years be the one giving the injection to the anti-fascist Pope? So putting that together, the Gemstone file has certainly some provocative questions to ask, and I'm not putting it all down because it's that kind of information that does whet your appetite. There's another section of the Gemstone files where he makes the statement, 2 murders had to occur before John Kennedy was killed in order to get away with this killing. And he cites Senator Estes Kefauver. He said his crime commission had uncovered the original deal in 1932 between Aristotle Onassis, Joe Kennedy, the father of John Kennedy, and Meyer Lansky for the international narcotic swindling that they were doing. And Kefauver was planning a speech on the Senate floor to denounce these mafia operations. Instead, he ate a piece of apple pie laced with sodium morphate, had a sodium morphate-induced heart attack on the Senate floor. The second murder that he says had to take place was Philip Graham, the editor of the Washington Post, who was married to Catherine Meyer. And Bruce Roberts says in the Gemstone files that Eugene Meyer's daughter, Catherine, was to take over the mafia-controlled Washington Post, and they also own the Newsweek. And Graham was a very strong John Kennedy worker. He put together the John Kennedy-Lyndon Johnson ticket. He was Kennedy's best friend in a struggle against the power of Onassis and the mafia. This is from the Gemstone file. He said Catherine Meyer Graham bribed the psychiatrist to certify that her husband was insane. He was allowed out of the asylum for the weekend. He died of a gunshot wound in the head, and the death was ruled as a suicide. I don't know and have no way to check out the links of Eugene Meyer and his links to the mafia. This was an allegation made by Bruce Roberts that I cannot support. I do support the belief that Philip Graham was murdered, that this suicide was like the death of George de Mohrenschildt. I believe he did have to die at that time, and the circumstances of his death gave Catherine Graham tremendous power, which she has wielded even in the role of the Washington Post getting Richard Nixon out of office in their one-sided investigations. The power of the Washington Post and Newsweek combined with Henry Luce's power in Time and Life and their syndicate fortune is overwhelming with the assassins. They work hand in glove with the CIA mafia-connected links. I don't know how much Senator Estes Kefauver knew. I know that the man who worked with him, who would have been controlling his campaign if Kefauver ran for vice president, was Bernard Fensterwald of the CIA, one of the dirtiest dogs to walk the face of Washington. He's a Senate lawyer. He turned up at the time of Watergate and became the attorney for James McCord. I've known Fensterwald, unfortunately, for quite a few years, at least 8 or 9, and I have utmost contempt for him, and I can link him, at least physically, in the presence of situations where people died in 2 cases just 7 or 8 weeks after he was present. I don't trust Fensterwald, and I don't know what role he had at the time, going way back with the Kefauver death, but in the Gemstone files, 2 deaths are necessary according to Bruce Roberts, and those were Kefauver and Philip Graham. I think the death of Marilyn Monroe that took place just a month or so before John Kennedy killed was a primary death or murder that had to take place because with her relationships with John and Robert Kennedy, it could hush Robert Kennedy up and they could blackmail him from not investigating his brother's murder. I think the Marilyn Monroe death was more important in my research, but for reasons that he never documents or goes into detail, Bruce Roberts said that Kefauver's death and Philip Graham's were primary before the Kennedy assassination took place. Now, where Bruce Roberts gets way off base, I believe, is in the story of the Kennedy assassination, and because that's the area I know the best, I have to use it as a yardstick to base the value of some of the other information, which I can't get into. His account of the Dealey Plaza killing of John Kennedy goes this way. He says there were 4 shooters, Lee Harvey Oswald, Eugene Brading, Jimmy Fratriano, and John Rosselli. E. Howard Hunt, James McCord were at Dealey Plaza, and Frank Sturgis was in Miami. It's the other way around. There's no proof that Lee Harvey Oswald shot any gun November 22nd, 1963, so I don't believe that Oswald was one of the shooters at all. There's no evidence that McCord and Hunt were at Dealey Plaza. There are no photographs of them that could confirm that. But there's reason to believe Frank Sturgis was there, so I believe that Bruce Roberts has turned this around. He goes on to say that Jimmy Fratriano, shot from the Dow, Texas building. Now, I can't say that Fratriano did or didn't shoot at the time of the Kennedy assassination. He's been called before the House Select Committee to testify about where he was, except for the fact that he did publicly say Kennedy should be killed, and he did work with Robert Mayhew and the CIA Mafia assassination teams. There has been no photograph of Fratriano in the Dallas-Fort Worth area up to or after the assassination. Nobody said they saw him there or registered as any alias. That doesn't mean he wasn't there. But up till now, there's been no proof that Fratriano was there at all. And I have the feeling that the assassins were better trained, as I said before on this program, in Oaxaca, Mexico, by Albert Osborne, and that they were not this assassination team. This team may have picked up some shells at Dealey Plaza. He says Fratriano shot from the Dow Tex building, but has no supporting document or photograph to prove it. Bruce Roberts said that John Rosselli shot John Kennedy once on the right side of the head, blew his brains out from behind the fence. Again, this is questionable. Nobody saw John Rosselli at Dealey Plaza. He was well-known mafia man in 1963. That doesn't mean he wasn't there, but he says categorically that Fratriano shot one shot from the Daltex and Rosselli did the fatal shot. The third point of triangulation he claimed was supplied by Eugene Brading from that small pagoda at Dealey Plaza. Now, Brading is a mafia member who later went on to join the early La Costa gang down in San Clemente when that resort opened. Brading was seen at Dealey Plaza, and he was given aliases, and he did walk over the Daltex building afterwards to make a telephone call. He could have left a gun in the bushes that one of the other men picked up. I know Oswald didn't shoot a gun November 22nd, 1963. I don't know where Fratriano was. John Rosselli is dead, killed right after he testified before the Senate House Select Committee. And Eugene Brading has never been called to testify before anyone. So I just give you the allegations and what I think of them. I also have this statement here from the Gemstone file. Bruce Roberts said Lee Harvey Oswald shot John Connolly twice from the Texas School Book Depository. He left the front door of the building with his rifle in the building. There was a backup man. Instead of taking it out, they left it so that Oswald would be the patsy. I don't believe that Lee Harvey Oswald shot John Connolly twice at all. If he were going to be the patsy, they would have left the bullets around the car that they were in or in the hospital to positively link them to Lee Harvey Oswald's gun. There were no bullets found except a pristine bullet numbered at Commission Exhibit 399, and that doesn't link to Lee Harvey Oswald in any sense, and there were no fingerprints on the rifle that was supposed to be Lee Harvey Oswald's, and the direction of the shots couldn't have come from the sixth-floor window the way that John Connolly was shot. The paraffin tests on Lee Harvey Oswald were negative on his head and hands. He couldn't have fired a weapon that day without holding the gun. There is no way to link Lee Harvey Oswald to any weapon. Therefore, I don't believe that he shot John Connolly twice, and I think that Bruce Roberts is filled, in this case, with this information. Marina Oswald was recently on a national television show saying that Lee Harvey Oswald wrote a letter from USSR to John Connolly saying that when I come home, I want to work for you. Well, John Connolly was Secretary of the Navy when Oswald was in the Navy. He was the governor of Texas at the time, and being as he was an important agent when the U-2 flight was downed and Oswald was in Russia, I think that his contacts to Connolly were more friendly than people believe. And I don't believe he shot anybody, and I don't believe what Bruce Roberts said about Oswald shooting John Connolly. The Gemstone file also says that 3 men were dressed as tramps, then picked up shells from the ground at Dealey Plaza, and one of the men was Howard Hunt. He said a Dallas police officer ordered 2 Dallas cops to go over to the boxcar and pick up the tramps. They were released without being booked. Well, many people know the book Coup d'etat by A.J. Weberman, where he makes the allegations that 2 of the 3 men that were taken away were E. Howard Hunt and Frank Sturgis, and many of you have the book and you've seen the picture of the tramps. We know that 3 men were paraded off and have been described as the tramps. There's no picture of these 3 men picking up any shells at Dealey Plaza. He says that they were picking up shells, but there's no evidence that these 3 men leaned down and picked up a shell. I've seen all the pictures of Dealey Plaza that are available, but I've never seen a picture of these men picking up the shells. The only photograph we have are the 3 men being led away by men disguised as Dallas police. In the Gemstone file, he says the Dallas police ordered the cops to go over the boxcar, but there's no tape recording of it. There's no proof that the Dallas police were ordering anybody. There is evidence that men wearing the uniforms of the Dallas Police Department were escorting 3 men away from the scene, but later they couldn't be identified as Dallas policemen. So this kind of reasoning or misinformation that's in the Gemstone file should be broken down very seriously, and you should ask for your evidence and realize that not all of it is true and that it's very dangerous to go by this file. I'll read you some more quotes. He said, "The rest is history," after John Kennedy was killed. Aristotle Onassis was so confident of his control over the police, the media, the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service, and the United States judicial systems that he had JFK murdered before the eyes of the nation, then systematically bought off, killed off, or frightened off all witnesses, and then put a 75-year seal of secrecy over the entire matter. Now, if you think seriously about that statement, you realize that Aristotle Onassis didn't have that kind of power. He didn't control Earl Warren. He never was around the United States to control the Dallas Police Department. People like Niagros, his competitor, or Tom Pappas, the Greek shipping oil clerk who had entree into the White House with Spiro Agnew and Richard Nixon and the Rockefellers, had more political clout than any Aristotle Onassis had in this country. And it seems that the whole Gemstone file has two scapegoats. One is Onassis, and the other is the Mafia. Onassis had some kind of information, but I think Onassis was a victim. I think that Jacqueline Kennedy was sent to Onassis to babysit him. He put up a large amount of money to try and find out who killed John Kennedy, and there's been stories that that's the reason his own son was murdered. And then Niagros murdered Onassis' ex-wife. He was murdered, and the man wasn't even held for charges. And Onassis then died alone and had to kick out Marie Callas and make way for Jackie. I think that Onassis was curious and maybe wanted to know the way the narcotics traffic was going to flow. He has a big investment here and so forth, but I can't believe that Onassis has this clout over the entire Warren Commission or Lyndon Johnson. He dealt with a different ball of wax at a different level, and he didn't have the control over the system. Furthermore, Onassis is dead, and all of these witnesses now that are being killed off are escalating. People like George DeMorenshield and Gary Powers and William Sullivan of the FBI and Carlos Prios-Sequeiros, Charles Nicoletti, all these deaths, the last 6 FBI men that died in the last 6 months that I've talked about, the witnesses are dying like flies, and Onassis isn't around to reap the benefits. So for some reason or other, Bruce Roberts had a fixation about the power of Aristotle Onassis. And I think in the end, when the power control group took over, Onassis was a victim like Richard Nixon, and he was under the control of people. He became victimized, and it was not Onassis who had the power. Now, the Gemstone goes into various payoffs that people involved in the assassination had, and I tend to agree with him on that point. He talks about John Rosselli, who got a $250,000 finder's fee for bringing Howard Hughes to Vegas in '67. That was just a clear-cut payoff and may have had something to do with his links to Jack Ruby and having Ruby kill Lee Harvey Oswald. He cited Jimmy Fratriano getting a $109,000 loan, non-repayable, in California, and started a trucking company in Imperial Valley. Eugene Brading became a charter member of La Costa Country Club, the Mafia Heaven. Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission was appointed President of the United States by Richard Nixon. John McCone, who covered this up, former head of the CIA, became a member of the ITT Board of Directors. Richard Helms became CIA Director. Leon Jaworski became the Special Watergate Prosecutor. He calls that government in theater. And then 2 people who got their reversed payoffs, who were hurt by some of this assassination inquiry, was a Dr. Red Duke, he cites, who dug 2 bullets out of John Connally and saved his life, and then was shipped to Afghanistan by the CIA to hush up the information about the bullets in John Connally. And then he cites Jim Garrison, who had all his witnesses shot out from under him and was framed and charged with bribery and extortion. There is no doubt that there was a lot of payoffs for people that covered up the Kennedy assassination. Bruce Roberts goes into Daniel Ellsberg. He said in May 1971, folk hero Daniel Ellsberg, the war hawk from Rand Corporation, who designed the missile ring around the Iron Curtain, released the fake Pentagon Papers. It distracted attention from John Kennedy's death, Robert Kennedy's death, Martin Luther King's murder, Howard Hughes' disappearance. He said the Pentagon Papers were designed by Ellsberg and Rand Chief McNamara, who became the World Bank head, to make the Vietnamese War look like one of those incredibly dumb mistakes. Now, I take issue with the Gemstone file on this and many other points. I'll explain why on this issue, and then if any of you want the copy of the Gemstone file, the 20 pages, you can write to me. It comes about 10 cents a page. For $2, I'll mail you. I got letters last week, and I'll mail you your own set so you can read and analyze it. If the purpose of Ellsberg's coming forward was to hide the assassination information, it had the opposite effect. The very first broadcast I had on KLRB was in May 1971, and I was asked to analyze the Pentagon Papers and what it meant at the time. And I said that the Pentagon Papers was maybe a moment of truth coming through, and that the real truths to go over the air would be the stories of the killing of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And that's when I began my programs here on this station, and we've been on 6.5 years. The Pentagon Papers hardly hushed up the political assassinations, but opened up a Pandora's box. Another point is that I have read the Pentagon Papers very carefully, and in them, Daniel Ellsberg makes it very clear by printing the State Department papers that the death of John Kennedy began the escalation of the war in Vietnam, that November 24th, 1963, for no noticeable reason, the northern Vietnamese came down just exact place where they had been up to the time of the death of Kennedy, but the South Vietnamese escalated the war with the American troops. And he showed in the Pentagon Papers that we had been planning this war for a long time, and evidently we had to have Kennedy dead before they could escalate and begin the war, and Lyndon Johnson was their man. So Bruce Roberts is very unfair about that. I think that the Pentagon Papers also showed our American assassination team for what it was. It showed very clearly the murder of DM and his brother-in-law, implicated Henry Cabot Lodge in Washington, the powers that be in Washington. It was the first glimpse of the assassination teams running from Washington, D.C. that were spreading all over the world. The Pentagon Papers was a major contribution, and Bruce Roberts has put it down as being fake. A lot of people have tried to discredit Daniel Ellsberg. If they do, they haven't read the papers. I've read them, and I believe that they were a major contribution. And after they were published, Louis Tackwood of the Los Angeles Police Department came forward and told about Squad 19 and the plans to kill Nixon and about the Watergate team in the White House. He identified with Daniel Ellsberg and began to spill stories. One of them I'll go into next week about Louis Tackwood and a lawsuit going on now up in the Marin County. I'll be on that next week with you. Tackwood came forward because Daniel Ellsberg did. And then a man named Larry Shears came forward and talked about how alcohol, tobacco, and firearms were going to kill Cesar Chavez. And they saved the life of Cesar Chavez by exposing the assassination teams, the Treasury Department. And then Mr. Martinez came into the Chicano riots in Los Angeles, the agent provocateurs. Ellsberg was a source of inspiration to Colonel Hebert over Vietnam. He was a major contributor to getting some truths out. Sure, there's things he knows that he didn't tell, and he could tell us a lot more. But I don't think the burden was on Daniel Ellsberg. I think he did a magnificent job. There are many things about the Gemstone papers which I like. There are many which I know are absolutely wrong. You have to read history. You have to read 700 or 800 books like I've done to make an analysis. But I did promise you I would go into it, and you can get a copy of the Skeleton Key yourself and read it. I think that's enough for me to cover on Dialogue Conspiracy, and I hope it's clear to you, and the best thing you can do is then read it for yourself. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel. Have a good year. We're starting a good year, 1978, and I'll see you next week on Dialogue Conspiracy.
You've been listening to Dialogue Conspiracy with Mae Brussell.